spring of 2012. It was a wet, cold, windy night. I was out covering yet another story on the upcoming Olympics. The cab driver got lost. I was navigating, I was writing my story, I was speaking to my editor in New York. The cab driver was more lost. I was moved from one location to another, writing my story, rewriting my story, dealing with my editor in New York. At close to midnight, I finally stopped. I stood in the cold and the wet and the wind near Tower Bridge. Camera and lights upon me. But this time, unusually for me, I was a little bit more stressed and discombobulated than normal. I'm a television journalist. I've worked undercover. I've worked and lived in dangerous parts of the world. I do live shows all the time. I've also worked on big programs that get very carefully scrutinized. I give talks on stages, at conferences, at lecture halls. I've been doing this for 2 decades, and working under pressure is pretty much second nature for me. So there I was, I stood in position, camera, lights upon me. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I heard in my ear, cue Tazeen. And I went blank. I couldn't think. All my words, that carefully rehearsed script I had put together, just disappeared. I tried desperately to recall them as the audience of America's most watched news program watched me. Still nothing. And then I ad-libbed, and I ad-libbed very poorly. After 10 of the longest seconds of my life, finally cut to the piece that I was trying to introduce. I can't imagine for a second the conversation that took place in the control room. I try not to think about it too much, but I imagine it wasn't very flattering and it probably involved a lot of expletives. Then I came off air and my producer called me and he said, "What the heck happened?" "I don't know," I said, genuinely bewildered. I just don't know. I'm a journalist who's been trained to work in hostile environments, and the training says that if you're thrown into the deep, dark, unknown, take 3 deep breaths. If a bomb goes off and you need to scarper or leave or think about what to do next, take 3 deep breaths. If someone is terribly injured and you need to help, take 3 deep breaths. The sudden onset of stress starves your brain of oxygen. If you need to think properly and function properly, you need to give it oxygen back. Until that moment in the spring of 2012, I had never forgotten my words on air. 5 years ago, in 2010, I experienced a trauma, the scale of which was so horrifying and so enormous that for a long time I couldn't even describe it. And in order to protect my privacy and the privacy of those who were also involved and affected, I cannot share it and I will never share it. But what I will share is what it did to me. In a key moment, stress flooded my body, adrenaline kicked in, and when I look back, that's what I remember. Thinking absolutely nothing and feeling a tsunami of adrenaline flooding me. I took a breath and shock stole that breath away from me forever. At the same time, it slammed a metaphorical sledgehammer right where my memory lay. I don't recall what happened next. I know it, but I can't recall it. Dissociative amnesia, psychogenic amnesia, traumatic amnesia. There are so many names for it. It's as powerful as being concussed, say psychologists. For me, in simple terms, it just means that I forget. So I grew up with trauma. To cope as a child, I disassociated. The result of which was that areas where my memory was stored and processed in my brain became damaged. But soon, childhood was over, and I recovered, and my brain recovered. And then 5 years ago, I was thrust into terror and darkness again. What happened was bad enough, but what it left me with was utterly, utterly debilitating. It's a wound that nobody can see. So now, I forget things. My memory goes blank. Every day, I grapple in the darkness of my mind to try and remember, and I struggle to store new information. I knew that I'd failed to recall the words for this TED Talk, so I broke the rules. And like in all my public speaking, I have my precious notes. I can rely on my research, I can rely on my writing. I can't rely on being able to retain or to keep memory, remember memory. Once I forgot my own name. I was with a friend and we were in a rural area and he disappeared off sort of 100 or 200 yards down the road to a wedding hall. He had to pop in and drop something off. And while I was waiting in the dark, in the cold, wet, windy dark, there's something in that, right? Keeps happening to me. While I was waiting in the dark, I think I get a little bit scared. It was dark and it was late. And I started thinking, what if someone comes over and says, what are you doing here? What's your name? Who are you? And I said, what's my name? What's my name? What's my name? And round I spun, thinking, what's my name? What's my name? Mary? Susan? Louise? No. After 20, 30 minutes, he came back. He sat into the driver's seat, and he turned to me very casually and said, hi, Tazeen. Sorry about that. Are you okay? I thought, that's my name. Another time, I was walking around in Victoria in central London, an area that I know very well. I go there all the time. I work there quite a lot. And I came out of a building that I know really well. And I looked around me, and I couldn't figure out where I was. I didn't know where I was going, and I didn't know what I was doing there. I looked at the buildings, and they were familiar to me as buildings, but I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know where I was supposed to be. And I thought, tube station, get to a tube station. And I started walking round and round in circles, literally round and round in circles, on the same street. And where I was is just around the corner from Victoria Tube Station. I know it really, really well. That day, I had no idea. Other times, I've forgotten really obvious information about myself, what I was just doing, what I need to do next. Thoughts that I scramble to retain leave me far too soon. I am buried in a mountain of Post-its at home. And by the way, this isn't everyday forgetfulness. The NHS website says, someone with dissociative amnesia will repeatedly have periods they cannot remember key information about themselves or about events. These gaps in memory are much more severe than normal forgetfulness. These blank episodes may last minutes, they may last hours, or they may last days. I affectionately call these memory blanks my black holes. Hang on a second, I just need to write that down before I forget it, is my most overused phrase. My kids will put it on my tombstone, I'm quite sure of it. And I have lots of tricks. I walk around with a pen. I write memos in my hand, I have some today. I rely on notes. I do my pieces to camera in 2 or 3 shots. I ad-lib them if I have to, if I can, so that I don't need to recall a script. And I rely on me, my passion, my writing, my research, my knowledge. So yeah, childhood trauma and adult trauma combined does that to the mind. The hippocampus, where memory is formed and processed and stored, gets damaged and it shrinks. So my body has kept score of what I've been through. Here are the top 4 things I've learned about trauma. Number 1, it feels like a bomb blast to the life, to body and mind. It overwhelms you in its flames and there is no respite. Number 2, 80% of people will suffer a traumatic event in their life, ergo, we are more likely to experience a traumatic event than not. 1 in 4 kids will experience an event which will go on to affect them throughout their lives. 25 to 30% of people will experience a traumatic event which will then or may develop into a serious disorder. Number 3, trauma can strike at any time. Nobody is immune. A terrible accident, a violent attack, a natural disaster, a war, anything extreme, inexplicable, unexpected, and horrific are its key traits. Number 4, one of the most violating aspects in the aftermath of trauma is hearing not just from the authorities, but also from people you love and who love you dearly. It's over now. You've got to move on with your life. I'm not a scientist. I'm not going to show you before and after pictures of the brain. I'm not going to explain what happens to the brain of a traumatized person, although that's not to say I don't understand it very well. I have a pile of books this high on trauma. I'm a student of psychology and psychotherapy now. I've read an endless number of journals on neuroscience and the brain's plasticity. I've almost completed a certificate in psychotraumatology, and I'm a member of the UK Psychological Trauma Society, as well as the European Society for Traumatic Stress Studies. If I was going to be afflicted with this, I was going to understand it the best way I could. So here's how I responded to my life's events. I found myself looking for kindred spirits, and I found them in our greatest writers. In a real dark night of the soul, it is always 3 o'clock in the morning, day after day, said F. Scott Fitzgerald. And I chose this because it sums up the private hell of trauma. I've been drawn to dark stories all my life. Subconsciously, I didn't realize it. I was working on one story after the other that was dark and terrible. And then I started to do it consciously. After this event 5 years ago, I started to look for those stories because I wanted to tell those stories. Sort of turned into the Darth Vader of storytelling. I've interviewed hundreds of people over the years who experienced something so terrible that they too temporarily lost their minds. And I'd like to honor their experiences by just telling you about a few of them right now. The parents whose daughter was killed in a vicious honor killing. The man who quietly told me about how he went into hospital with his pregnant wife who had stomach cramps and she bled to death in front of him. The young woman viciously raped over 4 years by gangs of men, 72 men in total. The amazing cop who put his life in danger for 20 years infiltrating pedophile groups. The father whose beloved son went to Afghanistan to fight jihad unbeknownst to him and then disappeared forever. The mothers whose children were abused by the very men they had fallen in love with and married. The couple kidnapped by pirates, never knowing if they'd be freed. And the teenager abducted by the Taliban in ultra-conservative Pakistan, raped by local police and the men who abducted her, left pregnant, and when she fought bravely for justice, her brother was shot dead in front of her. Trauma has so many ugly faces, and all of these extraordinary people have faced one of the most hideous sides of life. And after trauma, as if to add insult to injury, there's more hideousness. Here's what the traumatized are left with. Uncontrollable physical conditions, anger, numbness, hypervigilance, fear, fatigue, flashbacks, lack of concentration, lack of confidence, lack of trust, despair, fogginess, depression, anxiety, panic attacks, shame, guilt, stress, nightmares, and memory failure. For me professionally, the most brutal blow was memory loss. Personally, I swung between numbness and hypervigilance and terrifying nightmares. But look, today is not just for me about telling you about the bad news and the ugliness. I also want to tell you about something really fantastic and amazing. The world breaks everyone, and afterwards, some are strong at the broken places, said Ernest Hemingway. Over the last 20 years, psychologists and the scientific community are talking about something called post-traumatic growth. In other words, the gift of adversity. All of those people that I met, all those people that I interviewed, they didn't want what had happened to them to have happened in vain. So some campaigned for changes in the law. Others spoke out to shed light, to expose. They took new jobs, they took new roles, and they gave their life new meaning. After 9/11, researchers found that 58% of people found that there were personal and existential benefits. Life felt more precious. People were kinder to each other. After life kicked me in the teeth, I found renewed purpose. I started to lobby on things I really care about. I used my profile to do that. I helped others with their campaigns. I worked to improve my life and those of others. I've done more public speaking on things I care about in the last year than I have done in 2 decades of television. But look, post-traumatic growth, it's very controversial. There's not a consensus about it, and there's a lot of talk about not being able to measure it. Some say that talking about the opportunity that trauma gives and provides is an insult to those who have suffered, and I say, if you've got a silver lining, please, please, hand it over. Of course you would not have wanted to have suffered in the first place. Of course you may remain haunted for years, but in the midst of it, you can develop new perspectives and new capabilities, and I think that's amazing. So this is how psychologists describe post-traumatic growth. There's a trauma and the life around it. It takes up a lot of space, as you can see. As post-traumatic growth happens, the trauma doesn't get smaller, it stays the same size, but life grows around it. Your life gets bigger as you heal. I think this is really exciting, and I think this is really hopeful, and it is not true for everyone, but it is definitely true for me. You'll note that I've not said PTSD. I think the term has become so medicalized, so depersonalized, so stigmatized, so closely associated only with war veterans and soldiers that today I want you to think of it as adversity, as traumatic experiences, as losing one's mind. How did I mend? Well, first of all, I did a lot of grieving. I processed my memories. I read a lot. I did a lot of writing therapy. I did a lot of therapy with two amazing women at the Tavistock who literally saved my life. Meditation, exercise, sleep, human connection, intimacy, friendship, laughter, love, friendship, laughter, love, and lots of memory tricks. And then I made changes in my professional life. I took on only stories I really cared about, or that were fun or enlightening to work on. I turned my other interests into work: emotional intelligence, emotional health, psychology, psychotherapy, helping others find how to live a deeper and more fulfilling life. So yeah, I got myself a little bit of that PTG. When you have therapy for trauma, they get you to picture a place that makes you feel safe, where you can go to in your mind, that gets you away from the terrible memories that can flood. And this is my beautiful, comforting bookshelf where I read and read and read and read and read. And I did a lot of reading and a lot of walking. So what would I suggest for others? Learn a new skill, do things you love. This builds new pathways in the brain. Tell your story again and again until it loses its grip on you, to a journal, to professionals, to people you trust. Leave no stone unturned. Know that you'll get control of your body and your mind again. Laugh hard, love deep, and bring your friends close. You can never go back, so you need to embrace forward momentum. Evidence shows people who've been through hell care a lot less about what others will think of them. Be that person. Emily Dickinson said, after great pain, a formal feeling comes. The nerves sit ceremonious like tombs. And I sort of feel like this is where I am now. I'm starting to feel formidable on the inside. I'm a little bit ashamed and quite proud of the story I'm going to tell you. So I was on the London Underground at King's Cross on the escalators, and there were 3 people in front of me, and they started to stumble. And as they started to stumble, their luggage, they were slightly older, so they were struggling to keep a grip. As they started to stumble, they was having a domino effect. So they were going to fall on me. I was next. And what did I do? I didn't reach out to try and help. I didn't try and help them with their luggage. Other people were doing that. I coolly stepped aside. And I did that, literally pushing the woman next to me out of the way as I did that. And I thought to myself, oh my goodness, my survival instinct is so strong that I will step out of the way of disaster and not potentially plummet to my death. And then I thought, oh my goodness, my survival instinct is so strong that I will step out of the way and I will let other people potentially plummet to their death. It's kind of disgusting. And I do think it's disgusting. But I'm also proud of it because I wouldn't have done this before. I'd have been frozen. That was my survival instinct. And now I'm more resilient for what I've been through. And clearly, if disaster were to strike again, I can take care of myself. So what are the things I'd like you to take away from today? We all need to talk about trauma because we could all be affected by it. Remember, 80% of people. We needed to stop being a shameful, invisible wound. It is too big and it is too bloody to hide it. We need to respect it like we do all physical illnesses. I would never have hoped for adversity or trauma to have visited my life, not in childhood and not now. It was terrible and it was earth-shattering, and I wish it had never happened. But I also hope that I am living, breathing, positive proof that Ralph Waldo Emerson was right when he said, when it is dark enough, you can see the stars. Thank you.